I want to especially thank our partnership with the Islamic Doctors Association. We just greatly appreciate your leadership on campus, and we also appreciate the fact that you guys are med school students at the best medical school in the country. Also want to thank Dr. Ahmed. For some of you, you may not realize, but Dr. Ahmed, in his leadership, was able to help us bring a scholar from Princeton about a year and a half ago or so, which was a wonderful time, a thoughtful presentation. We appreciate you and your leadership. So without further ado, you're going to introduce our speakers for the night. Thank you. Oh, and I didn't say this, but I should. We are just so appreciate you. We wanted to give you a special gift from the University of Pikeville. We wish it could be more, but we're so glad. Once a bear, always a bear. So thanks a lot. Thanks very much. Thank you very much.
So I'll just read what you guys have in the back first. Ayub Palmer is pursuing a doctorate degree in Islamic Studies at the University of Michigan. He was born in England and grew up in Southern California. Palmer completed his bachelor's degree in history at UCLA and earned a master's degree in education, specializing in teaching English as a second language. After graduation, he taught English and studied Arabic in Amman, Jordan. Upon returning to the United States, he completed a degree in teaching Arabic as a foreign language and is currently a PhD candidate. Palmer's dissertation focuses on early Islamic notions of sainthood. And Dr. Waqas Ahmed is an American board certified in internal medicine and cardiology from the University of South Alabama Hospitals. He has taught medicine for 15 years and served as associate professor at Shifa College of Medicine in Islamabad, Pakistan, and Al Faisal University in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. Ahmed has written 2 books on issues facing contemporary Islamic societies and studied privately with scholars. He has taught Islamic studies to medical students for 10 years and serves on the board of directors of the Center of Islamic Studies, which recently published the first volume of the Integrated Encyclopedia of the Quran. So I think the first part is going to be Ustad Ayub Palmer. So we'll go ahead and give the floor to him to begin the talk.
Just going to put my phone on silent. We don't have any untoward occurrences here. So it's a pleasure, and I want to thank the University of Pikeville for inviting me today to talk about Islam. This is an important time now, especially with the events that are happening in the Middle East, events that are happening here in the United States, to begin an important discussion about Islam. What is Islam? Where does it come from? And what is the nature of Muslim beliefs? So I titled my talk Islam and Abrahamic Faith, because we want to get back to the source of the similarity between the different Semitic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and understand how they relate to each other, so that we can better bridge the divides that sometimes create conflict, sometimes create misunderstanding, etc. So I also said 3 faiths, 1 God. And there are a lot of polemics that center around the discussion of religion, different viewpoints. It's hard to sometimes tell who is correct, who is an authority, when somebody says something in the name of Islam, are they actually speaking as an authority or not? That's an important question, okay? So my research deals with early Islamic notions of authority and sainthood. So some of that will be cogent here in our discussion. So the question a lot of times that comes up is the Muslim God the same as the Christian God? Is it the same as the Jewish God? And there are books that people write making claims either one way or the other, right? Some people say, no, Muslims don't believe in the same God as Christians. Some people say no, they don't believe in the same God as Jews. So the question is what do Muslims themselves believe? That's an important question. What do Muslims themselves believe about God? So here's a quote from the Quran, the Muslim holy book. Muslims consider the Quran to be God's revelation to humankind. And in this verse, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذ يرفع إبراهيم القواعد من البيت وإسماعيل ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. And mention when Abraham was raising the foundations of the house, and with him Ishmael, saying, Our Lord, accept this from us. Indeed, you are the hearing, the knowing. So here, this is a supplication in the Quran, in the Muslim holy book, on the tongue of Abraham. And Abraham is at the Kaaba. You've seen that black cube called the Kaaba. Muslims pray in its direction in their prayer. And this building, Muslims believe that Abraham and Ishmael set the foundations of this building. They built the foundation. Okay? And as they were doing that, Abraham had a supplication to God. And he said, he was raising the house, and he said, Oh Lord, accept this from us. Accept this foundation from us. Indeed, you're the hearing, the knowing. So the question is so Muslims believe that the God of Abraham is the Muslim God. Okay, that's important. That's a very specific thing. When we say the God of Abraham, right? Muslims say that is the Muslim God. Whatever Abraham was worshiping, Muslims say that is who we worship. Okay? They also say the God of Moses. Moses actually figures most prominently in the Quran. His stories are mentioned more than any other prophet in the Quran. More than Muhammad, more than Abraham, more than Adam, more than any other prophet. And Muslims believe in the God of Moses. Whoever Moses' God was, Muslims say we believe in that. Right? So the question is when we say, okay, well, do Muslims believe in the same God as Christians? Then Muslims say, well, if we believe in the God of Abraham, do you believe in the God of Abraham? And most Christians usually will say, yes, we believe in the God of Abraham. So the question is then, do we believe in the same God? Right? And so Muslims, that's what Muslims believe. Okay? And we're talking in terms of what Muslims believe here. Okay? So then what is the name of God? So again, when we talk about the name of God, of course, that's an important discussion, right? In Judaism and in Christianity, the name of God. Okay? And Jews, for example, do not, as I'm sure you know, do not mention the name of God. Okay? But here we have in Genesis, in the Arabic translation of this passage from Genesis, فِي الْبَدْءِ خَلَقَ اللَّهُ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. So you see, when Jews translate the Bible into Arabic, what do they use? They use here Allah, that word, Allah. That's the Arabic word for God. Okay? That's the Arabic word for God. So here, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. So here, Allah here, you can even see the similarities, right? Allah and Elo, right? Okay? So we're talking about, Muslims again believe that this is the same God and that the same name applies. Okay? And there are other names for God, but we're using this particular name here, right? So, the way Muslims understand the the lineage of the prophets is that these prophets are like brothers and sisters in a sense. Okay? So here we see Adam. Muslims believe Adam was the first human being. Okay? And Adam's descent. Muslims believe in Adam's descent. And then they see Abraham as the patriarch here. Abraham is the patriarch. We have Isaac and Ishmael. Okay? And so Muslims see Isaac here, Moses, and then Jesus as coming from this. Of course, Muslims believe that Jesus had a virgin birth. Okay? Muslims believe Jesus had a virgin birth. But of course, he is in this line connected through Mary to Isaac. Okay? And there were many prophets here, many different prophets. There was David and Solomon, many different prophets. But here on Ishmael's side, there was only one prophet. This is what Muslims believe. There was only one prophet, and that prophet was Muhammad. Muhammad. So in a sense, Muslims believe that Muhammad was, you see, related to these prophets through Ishmael and Abraham. Okay? So this is how Muslims understand the lineage of the prophets, and how Muhammad, what Muslims believe as the last and final messenger, is connected to these other prophets. Okay? Even by lineage, right? And also spiritually, as Muslims believe. So, Muslims believe in, of course, angels as well. Okay? The angel Gabriel, the angel Michael. And here we have an important hadith. Now, hadith is, these are recorded sayings of the Prophet and his companions. And here we have an interesting hadith, which I think helps to summarize what Islam is about. Okay? And so in a sense, I want to let the source speak to you. I want to let the source kind of say itself what Islam is about, rather than me kind of like telling you, well, this is what it is, right? Because this hadith, or this narration from one of the companions of the Prophet about a situation that happened, is a hadith that summarizes Islam. Okay? And so here, this is how it starts off. Okay? There was a group, the Prophet Muhammad was sitting with a bunch of his companions. And all of a sudden this man comes in from nowhere. Okay? And so he says, Umar, one of the companions, says to him, while we were one day sitting with the messenger of God, peace and blessings of Allah upon him, there appeared before us a man dressed in extremely white clothes and with very black hair. No traces of travel were visible on him, and none of us knew him. He sat down close to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, rested his knees against his knees, and placed his palms on his thighs and said, O Muhammad, inform me about Islam. Okay, and then we'll go through some of what this hadith says about what Islam is. But it's important to see here that, and this person, later in the hadith we learn this person, the Prophet says this was Gabriel. This was the angel Gabriel who came to teach you about your religion. Okay? So, the angel Gabriel here comes as this man wearing white clothes and black hair, and he comes into this gathering and no one knows him in this dusty city, and they want to know, who is this guy? Right? And they're all wondering, who is this guy who comes out of the blue? We don't know him, it's a small city, everyone knows everybody, right? And he comes in, not only that, they consider Muhammad to be the prophet of God, and he comes up and sits right in front of him and says, Muhammad. He just speaks to him like he's his friend or something, right? Okay, so this kind of sets the tone for this narration, this story that comes down to us in the Muslim traditions. So first he talks about three things. He talks about 3 aspects of religion, right? So this summarizes how Muslims think about religion. And the first thing is Islam, okay? And you've heard that term, right? Islam. Islam, he says, has 5 pillars. Bearing witness to the one true God, okay? Bearing witness that there's no God but God, but the one God, i.e. the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, right? Praying 5 times a day. Okay, if you've seen Muslims pray, right? They turn towards the Kaaba and they stand and then they bow and then they prostrate and they get up again. They do it 5 times a day. And this is a prayer that is obligatory upon Muslims. Fasting during the month of Ramadan. You've probably heard about Ramadan, right? How many people heard about Ramadan? Okay, good, excellent. So you guys are coming from from a point of knowledge. That's great. So here, fasting is from sunup to sundown, no food, no water, no relations. And the idea is also being careful about what one says, one speaks, right? So that one only says good things and it is charitable. So we have fasting and then giving alms, 2.5% of one's savings. So Muslims are supposed to, or required to give alms every year. And that's 2.5% of one's savings if one has enough money and there's a particular amount required that indicates whether one has to give or receive, right? Or receive charity, alms. And then finally, the 5th one is pilgrimage to Mecca, okay? So you see these 5 things. These are Islam. In other words, if someone says, I'm a Muslim, these are the things they do. These are the actions they do. They say with testification of faith, they pray, they fast during Ramadan, they give money to the poor, and they go on pilgrimage once a year if they can, if they're able to. Okay? So, you see, here are the guidelines. Every Muslim agrees upon this. Okay? Every Muslim agrees on this, whether they're Sunni or they're Shiite, okay, the 2 major groups, they will agree on these 5 things. Okay, then Gabriel says, then Gabriel asks him, what is belief? Okay? And then he goes ahead to tell him, well, belief is, he doesn't actually tell you what, Gabriel doesn't say in this hadith, he doesn't give a theological understanding of what the nature of belief is. He doesn't say belief is light that comes into the heart. He doesn't say it's knowledge. He doesn't say it's testification outwardly and belief inwardly. Okay? That's a theological discussion, right? But what he does is he lists things that one must believe in. God, the messengers. Okay? So Muslims have to believe, these are things Muslims have to believe in. They have to believe in all of the prophets. In other words, to be a Muslim, one has to believe in all of the prophets. And Muslims believe these prophets are Adam, Abraham, amongst all of them, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. Muslims believe that Jesus is a prophet of God and had a virgin birth. Okay? Muslims have to believe in all of the revelations. That is the Torah, the Gospels, the Quran. In other words, a Muslim cannot be a Muslim if he says, oh no, you know, the Torah didn't exist. He can't be a Muslim if he says that, okay, or she says that. Muslims have to believe in all of the revealed books, right? And so that's why in the Quran there's a particular term for Christians and Jews, which is, anyone know? Yes, you got it. People of the books. Okay? Then the angels. Muslims have to believe in angels. They have to believe in the judgment day. And they have to believe in God's decree. If something good happens to me, it's from God. If something bad happened to me, it's from God. Muslims have to believe that. Okay. The last thing that Gabriel asked about was ihsan, sublime worship. Okay? So these are levels, right? You have Islam, the things you do outwardly, belief, what you believe, what you have to believe in your heart as a Muslim, And then the third is ihsan. It means excellence. It means beauty. It means, here I'm trying to translate it as sublime worship. Okay? Still, it doesn't quite give the meaning of the word in Arabic, but I'm trying to get close, right? Ihsan. Okay? To worship God as though one sees Him. Okay? That's how Gabriel defines, okay, this. To worship God as though one sees Him. Okay? Gabriel asks, and then the prophet tells. Okay? The prophet says these things, and then Gabriel says, "You're right," each time. Okay? So, sorry. Gabriel doesn't actually say it. The prophet says it. Gabriel asks, the prophet says it, and then Gabriel says, "Yes, you're right." Okay? But if one is not able to worship God as though one sees Him, then one should at least know that God always sees one. No matter where one is, God always hears, God always sees everything, everywhere, all the time. Okay? That's what Muslims believe. So we have here three things. We have Islam, we have Iman, belief, we have Ihsan. What's the highest you can go in worshiping God? It's to worship God outwardly, but inwardly to do what? To worship God as though one is seeing Him. In other words, one's certainty in God is so strong that it's as if one is seeing Him, right? Okay? So these are the three levels that Gabriel asks about. So the question is, in all of that, where's jihad? Okay? Where's jihad? I mean, Muslims believe in all of those things, but of course, here's the term that we all hear, right? In the news. Okay? Where is jihad in all of that? Okay? That's a question. Jihad definitely existed. Okay? Was there. But you have to understand that it doesn't represent a theological point of doctrine. Okay? You see, that's an important distinction here. Because sometimes it's portrayed as though jihad is something that Muslims, it's like it's a point of theological doctrine. Right? But it's not. Okay? Some Muslims actually think that. Okay? Some Muslims actually do think that. Right? Okay? But what Muslims have believed for the past over 1,000 years is that no, jihad is not a point of doctrine. Okay? In a general sense, it means struggle, okay? To do one's utmost to serve God. But in a restricted legal sense, okay, it means fighting, but is restricted to particular legal requirements, okay, and conditions. Seeking peace and reconciliation, however, is a religious duty upon Muslims as stated in the Quran. Okay? So, the doctrine of jihad, okay, does exist in the Quran, but it is restricted by certain legal requirements, okay, in particular circumstances. Okay? And people have to, that's an important distinction, and it's not a theological doctrine. It's not part of it's not something that Muslims have to do, right, to be a Muslim. Okay, and that's an important distinction. So then, again, another hot topic we see about is Sharia, right? Because there are some states here where laws have been passed to ban Sharia, right? You've heard about that, right? How many people have heard about that? Yeah, exactly. Okay, me too. Now the thing is, Sharia means like the way. Okay, it represents Muslim law. Okay, in the larger sense. But Muslim law, as understood historically and legally, was very different than we understand law today. Okay, law. In the pre-modern sense, of law, Jews had their law, Christians had their ecclesiastical law, Muslims had their Sharia, okay? Different people had their laws, and they all coexisted. In other words, if we're all sitting in this room and we have these different beliefs, each of us has a different law, okay, that applies to me. So if I'm a Muslim, then that means that Sharia applies to me, but it doesn't apply to you if you don't believe in that. You see? Now, how do we understand law in the modern sense? Okay? In the modern sense, law is, well, whatever the majority considers to be the law applies to everybody in a specific geographical location, in a state. Right? That's a very different understanding of what law is. Right? So, we can't conflate the two, right? Because these laws against Sharia assume that Sharia means that Sharia, the Islamic law, applies to everybody within a particular geographical space. But that's not how Sharia was understood historically or legally. Now, there are Muslims today who don't know anything about Islamic law historically or legally, who think that Sharia applies to everybody within a particular geographical location. But there are almost always people who don't know anything about Sharia as law, as Muslim law. Okay? So it's very important to understand that what we're talking about here is how Sharia is understood historically and legally by Muslim legal experts, right? So, for example, Osama bin Laden, right? That's a name everyone's heard, right? Okay, Osama bin Laden is an accountant, was an accountant, okay? He wrote a fatwa. Now, as an accountant, does that mean you're a Muslim legal expert? You know, Muslim legal experts go to school for 12 years or more to specialize in Islamic law. Did Osama bin Laden do any of that? No. He was a self-proclaimed Muslim legal expert, self-proclaimed, but he had no background. He was an accountant, okay? And he wrote up a legal document, a fatwa or a legal opinion that actually had no authority because it wasn't grounded in any of the schools of law. Muslims have particular schools of law. So it had no authority, and the person who was writing it had no legal expertise. Okay? So you see here, it's very important that we understand what is authority. Where does Muslim authority come from? Okay? And how is it grounded? In order to understand, is this really Sharia? Or is this what someone is claiming to be Sharia? Okay? Thank you very much. After Dr. Waqqas, I'm sure we'll have questions. Thank you.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate. There was a famous Arab grammarian, very celebrated grammarian, and one of the students was trying to be a smart aleck in his class, and he said, you know, there are only 4 types of people in the world. And I'm just going to give you the translation instead of the Arabic version. He said, there are people who know, and they know they know. They are teachers, so you learn from them. And there are people who don't know, and they know they don't know. There are students. You have to teach them. And there are people who know, but don't know they know. They are heedless. You have to remind them. And finally, he said there are people who don't know, and they don't know they don't know. They're fools. You have to avoid them. One of the fundamental problems of our time, and this goes across all religious denominations, Muslims, Christians, Jewish, is that people have moved away from God and religion. This is the time that we live in. And that's a fundamental problem that afflicts each religious denomination. we could argue all night about how globalization has played into a postmodern phenomenon and so forth and so on, and technology and so forth and so on. But that's where we start. That's where we are. We are in a place where religious ignorance is rampant. And the vast majority of Muslims, what to talk about non-Muslims, even the vast majority of Muslims do not read, do not understand the Quran, the text that is the foundation of the faith. And so that has to do with one of the facts that the overwhelming majority of Muslims are non-Arabs. Indo-Pak in India and Pakistan, and Malaysia, Indonesia, which are the most populous countries, are non-Arabs. And so without understanding classical Arabic, interpreting the Quran is a very dangerous thing, because the language itself has such extraordinary depth that unless you are an expert in the language, and if you try to interpret it, you get to the wrong interpretation, which is where a lot of these current problems are coming from. If I were to explain Islam to somebody, very simply, a 12-year-old and 11-year-old sitting there, I was trying to explain to them how does one look at Islam versus Christianity versus Judaism. The simplest explanation I have is Muslims look at Islam as a continuation of the message of God, which was sent down as the first human being, Adam, was sent down to earth. As the first human being descends down to earth because of a mistake, due to the insinuations of Satan, God made sure that the guidance was sent to human beings, so that when they are held accountable on the day of judgment, they can't say, but we were not told. We didn't know about this. And so this message continues in the form of prophets, and as Brother Ayub showed in the slide, it starts from Abraham and goes all the way down through Moses, Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, and finally the last prophet is, as we believe, Muhammad, where prophethood ends. And the reason it ends is because the message is now completed. So Muslims look at previous scriptures, including the Old Testament and the New Testament, as continuation of the message, and the Quran completes that message. Well, if you ask, well, why don't Muslims apply the Old Testament? Why is it not adequate for them? Why do they need a new book? Why not the New Testament? The reason is the Muslim belief is that those books, when they were revealed at a certain time, directed to a certain group of people, addressing certain problems, and so when the final messenger is sent down, now God perfects the message to humanity. And this is the final messenger, and the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad in Muslim belief is one of the greatest signs of the end of time. Because it's like the last chapter. You're reading a book, when you get to the last chapter, you know this is going to end now. So the sending of the last prophet is that the message is now complete. So Muslims look at the Quran as a completion of the same message. If there is a issue that is continued with the application is the same, the Quran continues the same application. If it needs to, it abrogates certain messages that were in the Old Testaments. So that's how we look at it. So if the Quran doesn't abrogate something which was already there in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that by default continues, unless the Quran clarifies it, or abrogates it, or changes its definition. So that's how we look at it. Like Brother Ayub said, the fundamental part of Muslim belief is in the belief of the prophethood of Moses. Prophet Muhammad is mentioned less than 5 times in the Quran. The total number of verses which mention Prophet Moses are 550. It actually, if you put those verses together, it's almost an entire chapter. And repeatedly, the Quran constantly goes back to the story of Moses and what happened with his people as a lesson to the Muslims now what they should not do. If you did this, you would incur the wrath of God. If you did this, this is a punishment. And it repeatedly, and the story of the birth of Jesus Christ, peace be upon him, is so vivid It's almost like a movie in front of your eyes. A whole chapter named after the Virgin Mary. And so one of the problems, I think, is that leads to such widespread misconceptions about Islam in the West is people don't read about Islam. And the most tragic thing is that these people who are brought in on TV shows as experts on Islam know less than 2% of Islam. Most of them have never read the Quran themselves. And I think it's a mistake that's multiplied. You know, like they say, practice makes perfect. Well, actually, practice makes permanent. It doesn't make perfect. So if it's a wrong thing, it's just going to get permanent. It's just got, that mistake gets multiplied and multiplied and multiplied. And so, you know, the wide misconceptions about Islam are simply because people have not read Islam. And the only Muslim they've heard about is Osama bin Laden. Or now, sadly, the group of fanatic murderers who call themselves Islamic State. I mean, there's nothing more horrific for Muslims to see that. I'm from Pakistan, and I can give you the statistics. These are absolute solid statistics. Since September 11, the total number of Pakistani citizens that have been killed by suicide bombings and violence inside the country at the hands of extremists is 56,000 as of last week. 56,000 people killed at the hands of those who claim to be real Muslims. 56,000. Okay? These are unnamed ones. These are unnamed ones. We know the 6 or the 12 who were killed in Paris, but these 56,000 are unnamed ones. Nobody knows them. So, and this, you can go on and on and on. If you look at the Pew Center's the last survey that they did, which is considered the most authentic survey, what's extraordinary is that when they asked people about what their opinion was about suicide bombing, 86% of people in Pakistan said that they could not justify it under any circumstances. Absolutely any circumstances. Less than 6% actually said that it could be justified. It would be justified for any reason. Less than 6%. If you look at the FBI statistics of the 150 or so terrorist events that happened in Europe in 2013, less than 10% were committed by Muslims. Less than 10%. You can look this up. This is all, you know, thanks to, we call it Sheikh Google. You know, it's like the sage Google where everything is there. You can look this up. The vast majority of the violent extremist events were because of race and you know, fringe groups and so forth and so on. And here's the most extraordinary thing. Professor from Georgetown, the one who's written the famous John Esposito. If you read John Esposito's work, who's considered one of the top authorities on Islam in the United States, John Esposito has quoted several studies in which when they asked people about what would justify in their mind violence, including suicide bombing, the most extraordinary thing was the overwhelming majority of people who said they think it's justified, it was for political reasons. They did not quote religion as the justification. It was politics. To understand what's happening in the Islamic world, particularly in reference to the violence that we see now, particularly in reference to the groups that do horrific things in the name of Islam, you have to recognize, you have to go back to history. Trying to make sense of this without historical context is absolute exercise in futility. Absolute exercise. It will be counterproductive. It will be counterintuitive. You have to look at the history. I'll encourage all of you to read this book by Zachary Karabel, K-A-R-A-B-E-L-L, called Peace Be Upon You, 1400 Years of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish interaction and conflict. You can get it from Amazon. It's an extraordinary book. He's an American academic researcher. and has written an extraordinary book in which he gives you an entire historical perspective of the relationship between Muslims, Jews, and Christians since Prophet Muhammad declared himself to be the last prophet. And what's extraordinary is that he shows you with historical data that of the 1400 years, if you exclude the last few decades, the vast majority of that time, there were extraordinary cordial relationships between Muslims, Christians, and Jews. There are historical facts that Jews preferred to live under Muslim rule because they were being persecuted by the Christian kings of that time. There are historical data that confirm that Christians preferred to live under Muslim rule because they were being persecuted by other Christian denominations. If you go today, to this day, to Istanbul in Turkey, in the old city of Istanbul, there's a Jewish quarter. There are Jews who live in the old city of Istanbul. Where did they come from? They were the ones who were picked up by the Ottoman Navy when they were being expelled from Spain. And nobody wanted them. And the Ottomans welcomed them. You go to Iran, well, you can't go to Iran, but if you ever went to Iran today, there are historic Jews, they're called the Safavids Jews. To this day, they are in Iran. To this day, in Egypt, there are more than 400 Coptic Christians who lived for 1400 years. And if you exclude the last few years of violence, they were so comfortable, they never left. Because their places of religion, their values, their life was protected. Because the Sharia demands that minorities, their religion, their places of worship, their freedom be protected. The Sharia demands that if they want to have their family feuds decided in their own courts, which are staffed by their own judges, that they have the right to do that. That's what Sharia demands. And so it's absolutely, it's just ludicrous when we hear, different governors saying, oh, we got to have law against Sharia. And like Brother Ayub said, the Sharia demands that if Muslims are a minority in any country, they must abide by the law of the land, which is the Constitution of the United States. They can't demand Sharia. I mean, it just doesn't work. The Sharia itself forbids that. So, and Islam is truly the religion of peace because the Prophet is described in the Quran as a prophet of mercy. He's described as a rahmatul lil alameen. He's a prophet of mercy. And the Quran says something which is extraordinary. Imagine the pagan Arabs with their idols. More than 300 idols in the house of God in Mecca. And they go and bow to them. I mean, there's nothing more horrific than the concept of monotheism for God. But what does the Quran say to the Muslims? The Quran says, do not curse their idols. Because if you did that, they will in turn curse God. So early Muslims were actually told not to even curse the idols, which was the worst atrocity anybody could commit to God, is to put idols in his place. And the Quran said, don't do that. How many people know that there's a verse in the Quran which says to the Muslims, if you were to look at those who are non-Muslims, you will find that those who call themselves Christians are the ones who are closest to you in love. How many people know that there's that verse? Did you ever hear that on Fox? That is something you will never hear on Fox. You just never hear that. And, if you read the life of the Prophet, he never took revenge for himself. Ever. He forgave everybody. Those pagans who killed, tortured his family members, his companions, and kicked them out of his beloved city of Mecca, and when he returns after 10 years or so, as the conqueror, what does he say? He says, "La tathriba alaykum al-yawm." He uses the same word that Prophet Joseph used when to his brothers. There is no reproach on you. You are all forgiven today. This is what he said. He said, you're all forgiven. And so for people to do things in the name of the Prophet, like one of our teachers, he said, you cannot honor the teachings of Prophet Muhammad by dishonoring his teachings. You cannot do violence in the name of protecting the honor of the Prophet. And one of the most, and I'll stop because we are running out of time, one of the most extraordinary hadith of narrations of the Prophet that I remember as a child was, we were told this hadith of the Prophet in which he said, on the day of judgment, each one of you will have, the word in Arabic is used samaha, which means wiggle room, with his Lord, as long as long as he has not shed unjust blood. That is one thing. He said, if you shed unjust blood, then that wiggle room is gone. And the last hadith about the non-Muslim minorities in Muslim land. The Prophet said, the most extraordinary thing is the Arabic term for that is dhimmi. Dhimmi means somebody who's under your protection, meaning you're responsible. If you're a babysitter, something happens to the baby, well, guess who's responsible? You're responsible. The Muslim state was asked to be responsible for this minority, more than the Muslims. And the reason was the Prophet said, if anybody is unjust to a non-Muslim minority citizen of a Muslim state, he said, on the day of judgment, I will be the prosecutor's witness. And for the Muslims, this was the most extraordinary thing that, I mean, this struck such fear in their heart, to have the Prophet as the prosecutor on the day of judgment against them because they were unjust to a non-Muslim minority living in their land, was enough to shake them up and put them on their toes. So that's the Islam that we know. That's the Islam that we practice. And for some fringe group somewhere coming in and then claiming to do it in the name of Islam is far more painful to us than it is to anybody else. That group of absolute fanatic, they could qualify under DSM-4 criteria for some psychiatric illness, who beheaded 2 Japanese citizens, burned the Muslim Jordanian pilot today. The punishment that he got at their hand was far more horrific. They burned him alive. And so, if you really look at the facts now, it's the Muslims who are at the receiving end of the worst treatment that these groups are doing. They're at the forefront. They have given the highest price more than anybody else. I think this is a challenge that all of us have to face collectively. And this is not a battle of weapons. This is a battle of ideas. You do need military strategy as well. There comes a time when military has to be used. But you cannot win a battle of ideas with bombs. It has to be fought with the battle of ideas. And the first step I would encourage everybody is to read about Islam. The text is there. You have excellent translations, but read it and make your own judgment. And I think that if we all were to study more, we'll find that we all have more common grounds than we do the differences. And I'll stop here. I apologize if I've taken more time. Thank you very much for your attention and for coming.
Okay, we're going to turn now to our question and answer segment. We deeply appreciate the thoughtfulness of your presentations and approaches. And just one side comment as I open up the floor. Remember, if you're coming from the Christian faith, I know as a Christian clergyman, when I see presentations like Westboro Baptist, I say they do not speak for me. An uninformed minority that's doing tragedy and defaming the name of something that I hold very dear. And tonight our presentation has spoken in the same way, that a fringe minority does not have the right or the legal standing to speak for us who hold our faith very dear and have an informed faith. So as you think about your own religious tradition, I ask that you present the same hospitality to those who may be different than you and say, let us listen to the true authorities to speak for their own faith. So, questions that you may have, I'm going to throw out the first question to you. Anyone who wants to, if a person were to begin to read the Quran, how do they start?
Just hit the mute button. Just keep it pressed. It'll turn green. Okay.
No?
Yeah.
Please. Great. Excellent question. So the Quran is a text that Muslims read. They start, it in a sense doesn't have a beginning or an end because it's read in circular fashion. In other words, Muslims start it and then they read it till the end and they start again, right? And so the Quran is a text that oftentimes non-Muslims who read it in English sometimes have a difficult time reaching it because the Quran is understood first and foremost to be a revelation in Arabic. Okay, there are good translations. So when you read the Quran, it's good to read the Quran also with some type of a explanation of the meaning, because many of the verses of the Quran came down in particular situations. Okay, and so, for example, one might read a verse. For example, there's a verse called the sword verse, right? Some people probably heard about that. Now, the sword verse is understood by legal experts to refer to a particular situation that was taking place between the Muslims in Medina and the non-Muslims in Mecca. So, for example, if someone reads the sword verse and then they think, oh, well, I guess that's what Muslims believe in, that would not be correct. Okay, and so the Quran is understood to be taken as a whole and to be interpreted according to how legal and theological experts and experts of exegesis would interpret that. Okay, that said, the Quran provides a lot of general truths. Okay, and an outlook towards life that anybody who reads it will understand directly. Okay, and so it's definitely good to read the Quran if you can, and then read if there are websites now that provide explanation for example, what particular verses may mean. Yeah, if you want to add anything.
I just wanted to make two quick points because they were important, I think, in relation to what we were talking about. When you guys hear these news about people who claim to be Muslims and do violence, I do want you to think about the same thing as we looked at Timothy McVeigh's action. Did that action represent the Christian values? And the answer is no. Did Breivik's murder of more than 80 or so people in Norway represent Christian values? And the answer is no. So this kind of thing is everywhere. The second thing I do want to say is that there's no denying a reality that there are serious problems in the Muslim world. But I would say this, that without historical context, again, it will not make sense because you have to go back about 100 years. Every single Muslim country, independent country, as you know now, was colonized. And so the impact of colonization and economic depravity, brutal dictators who have been in power for decades. So what you see in the Muslim world in anger and frustration is actually driven by these multiple factors. If you were to exclude that, you simply would not be doing justice to understand what's going on. You have to take that into consideration. So every major Muslim country has a dictator, who sadly remains in power because of overt or covert Western support. And so the ordinary Muslim people see that this person who persecutes them as a continuation of what's coming from something coming from the West. And so without that, this would not be just. That's one thing. The second thing, coming back to your question about the Quran, I think yes. One of my teachers, how he described is, and I think this would be a good way to start, is the Quran has two levels. There's a level for snorkelers. If you're a snorkeler, just stay on the surface. It has enough guidance for you to just glance through the verses and take guidance from it. And it'll make sense. But then it has a depth that's for a deep sea diver. If you're a deep sea diver, then you dive in. And then you need a lot more background. And any text, not just the Quran, I think it applies the same to the Old Testament and the New Testament, is you have to know the context. You can't do what's called cherry picking. If you pick a verse which was revealed at a particular time in reference to a particular group, and that order is not valid anymore now, that would be a bad plan. You don't want to do that, because that's the beginning of a lot of confusion. So you have to know the background of those verses that were revealed. And the New Good translations will have some explanation which would tell you what this was in relationship to a particular Jewish group at that time, which doesn't mean that you can apply that verse to all Jews as of today. Same thing if certain verses were revealed in relationship to particular Christians, and you can't just take that and apply it to Christians today. So it's very important to know the context anytime you read scripture. And then I think it takes time, but I think if you want to do that, you'll always find resources. I think one of the greatest benefits of technology and internet is there's enormous amount of information out there, both good and bad. You have to be careful where you're going to. But I think if you have Muslim friends and if you know somebody who's Muslim, that will be a good resource as well. If you read something that you're not sure about and this confuses you, ask them what that particularly means, and I think hopefully they'll be able to help you as well.
Great, thank you. And when we come to this point where you may ask a question, we ask that you reserve your questions to actual questions, as opposed to sometimes people make statements as opposed to questions. This is a time of question, and we know there will be time afterwards if you individually want to speak to one of our speakers, but this time is reserved for questions only.
As a continuation of the last question, two-part. One, if there was a translation to go towards, because especially with any sort of religious text, there's 1,000 translations, everybody's have their version. If you had one to throw out, I would, myself, I'm actually looking around for a translation to read, because I'm trying to get through every major religious text. And I know a lot of other people here probably are doing the same, especially with religion. If there's a specific text, specific translation into English, with love of recommendation. And the second one would be, there is an Islamic center close to here. As someone, myself, I'm not actually Christian or any particular faith, but for someone with a Christian background or a non-Christian background, someone who's non-Muslim, how would I go about going to a service just to have the experience and make those connections with the Muslim community?
Great question. There is a website called Quran.com, okay? Quran.com, and it has multiple translations, okay? So you can actually look at, there are like 5 or 6 translations. It doesn't have one of the translations, which is actually by a non-Muslim, A.J. Arbery. I like his translation of the Quran. There are, every translation has its issues, but in terms of language, I like his translation as one of the best, A.J. Arbery. But if you go to Quran.com, you can find you can see the list of all of the different translations, and you can see how they translate things differently from translation to translation. So there you can you can get the translation, Arbery's translation online through Amazon, or this website will have lots of different translations available.
Yes, so this point is very important because translation preferably has to be somebody whose mother tongue is English. Because if you're not, then English-speaking people instantly pick up on that they just don't feel comfortable with that text. But Marmaduke Pickthall is one of the earliest English translations, and it's good. There are two other which are very reliable and globally used. Yusuf Ali, and one is by the author of Islam at Crossroads. You remember the Austrian diplomat? You remember his name? If you just type in the author of Islam at Crossroads, I'm forgetting his name. He also has a very good, reliable English translation which has been around for almost 50 years. All three have been around for decades and are easily available everywhere. Regarding the Islamic Center of the Mosque in Prestonsburg, which is called the Islamic Center of Eastern Kentucky. The main service is on Fridays, because Friday is a holy day in Islam, just like Sunday is for Christians. Friday is the holy Islamic day, and we have a sermon and a combined prayer, which starts at the sermon starts at 2 p.m. every Friday. It's about 20-minute, 25-minute sermon, and then at 2:30 there's a prayer, a formal congregational prayer for about 10 minutes. And if anybody is interested in coming, they're welcome to come, and there's room in the mosque where they can just sit in the back and hear and attend the service. They're welcome. And if they have any questions, they are welcome to ask the leader of that particular day, who's giving the sermon, any questions or anything else they have. You're all welcome. The mosque is open 5 times a day. With each prayer, the mosque is open, because there's 5 prayers. And anybody who just wants to go and see how the Muslims pray is welcome to come. But Friday is a good day because most of the community people around are there on Fridays, because it's a small community here. So Friday is the best time to meet everybody. And you're welcome to come, women, men, anybody can come. You're welcome to come. Abdurrahim Green? No, I was talking about somebody else. It might come to my mind. I can't remember his name now.
Other questions?
You said in the Quran that Christians and Jews are seen as people that don't they receive previous revelations of God. How do most Muslims view Jews and Christians today with their revelations of God's will?
Sure, great question. So Muslims believe that those revelations were, as they were revealed to their prophets, were true revelations, right? And again, as Dr. Waqqas said, however, Muslims believe, just as Christians, when they looked at the Old Testament, they interpreted the Old Testament in terms of the teachings of Jesus, right? So for example, when it talked about the king, for example, some Christian exegetes would say, well, that refers to Jesus, right? Okay, so similarly, and so that was kind of the relation, one of the hallmarks of the relationship between Christians and Jews, right, is that Christians would interpret the Old Testament in terms of the teachings of Jesus. Now, Muslims similarly interpret the New Testament and the Old Testament in terms of the Quran. So Muslims say, well, we believe that the Quran is the criterion by which those other revelations are understood. Okay? And so obviously that means there is a recentering. Okay, that means that Muslims will interpret those other revelations differently than Christians or Jews would interpret them, right? Yeah. Hope that answered the question.
Slightly kind of shifting away from Quran, there's a certain topic that's been popping up through news and stuff like that, is the issue in Israel. So, do you think there's ever a chance going to be where peace between both the Muslims and Christians on the West Bank and the Israelites? Do you think there will ever be a chance of reconciliation within these next years or so?
That's a great question. Well, the thing is that we're always optimistic. Okay? I mean, the thing is that Muslims and Christians and Jews have been living in Israel-Palestine region for over 1,000 years, quite peacefully. And the recent conflict is something that's happened over the past 50, 60, 70 years, okay? So we have to understand that in context, right? So the prevailing situation was actually a peaceful situation. In fact, that region from the 16th century until about the 19th century, for 250 years saw no war whatsoever. So in other words, the entire history of the United States, which is about 250 years or so, think about it, that region there saw no war for about 250 years. Okay? So, and that's the entire, our understanding of what the United States, the length of our country is. So, the thing is that we're always believe that peace is the solution, and that reconciliation is the solution, and that people have to give up things that are hard to give up in order to reach that.
I just want to add that Muslims don't have a problem with the state of Israel or Jewish people. The problem was between the Palestinians and the Zionist movement, which sought to uproot the lawful Arab Muslim citizens of that land and expel them out. So the problem exists not between Muslims and Jews, but rather between Muslims and the Zionist movement. That was one thing. The other thing is that, just as Brother Ayub said, if you look at the history of Jerusalem, the only time it was conquered and with extraordinary peace, as documented by Christian historians, is in the time of Saladin. And you can read his books written by Christian historians. That was the only time when Jerusalem was taken without shedding any unjust blood. And in fact, the movie called Kingdom of Heaven, if you look at it, it's fairly accurate in its historical context, because it shows Saladin at the end going in and lifting up this cross which had fallen down in one of the churches and puts it back up. And he gave the right to the Jews and the Christians to live as they wanted to. One of the other things that a lot of people don't know is that when the Jews were expelled from Palestine, from modern-day Israel, from Jerusalem and that whole area by the Roman kings, they were only allowed back after several hundreds years of expulsion in the time of the second Muslim Caliph Omar. They were only allowed back in his time. And he said, they have religious places here. They have a right to come. Before that, for hundreds of years, they were expelled. They couldn't come back. And so, yes, if you look at the history, the relationship was very different than what we have seen since after World War II and the declarations and the British. I hate to blame everything on the British, but how the British divide. Well, but it is related, because all you have to do is look at the partition that the British did for India and Pakistan. An 8-year-old can do a better partition on a piece of paper. That partition led to 1.5 million people being killed on both sides. And they just packed their bags and left the next day. So they had Pakistan here, and then this huge chunk of land called India, and then West Pakistan here. which is which is Bangladesh to this day. I mean, it was set up to be just the most horrific experience from day first. If you look at the partition of today's Middle East, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, it's all arbitrary. They were all Arabs. This was Byzantine land. And they had families across the partition between Pakistan and Afghanistan. The locals in that area don't recognize that border. They have cousins, uncle and aunts living across the border. They don't consider that a border. But thanks to the British, we have a lot of boundaries which made no sense, were completely inappropriate. And I think that's a very major part of these conflicts that we see nowadays, is because how were these lands partitioned at that time? Nobody sat down and actually looked at the people, their racial makeup and their religious makeup and all sorts of things. And it was just, let's just take it up and this chunk goes to this and this chunk goes to this. And I think the modern day Palestinian and Israeli conflict traces its roots back to the unjust partitions that were done by the British at that time. But yes, we have to still work. I mean, our job is to do the best we can to work for peace. Like in Arabic they say, إنما على العبد الأسباب وعلى الله فتح الأبواب. It is for the slave, human being, to use means, and it is for God to open doors. We have to use whatever means we have at our disposal. But the final affair rests with God. And so we do our best we can.
Moving back a little bit, I had a question from earlier. So I know like you have 5 prayers a day. I was just wondering if you could maybe explain that, like are there certain times that all Muslims pray, and also when you pray, you have certain things that you pray about, like Christians have the Lord's Prayer. Do you have something like that, or just something just like praying for a sick family member or something? If you guys could just explain that a little.
The Muslim prayers have an external form and an internal form. And so there are certain sets of rituals which are very similar to actually the Jewish prayer. You bow down, you stand straight front, and you bow down, you face Mecca, you face the Kaaba, the house of God, and then you prostrate down. So it's done in a certain sequence. And then there are recitations that we read, so there are parts of the Quran that you recite in the prayer. And there are other prayers, as taught by the Prophet Muhammad to all Muslims, that you recite in each posture. So when you are prostrating, you have a certain prayer. When you are bowing, you have a certain prayer. When you rise up, you have a certain prayer. And in between, there are places where you read actual text of the Quran. The timing is extraordinary. There was a study a couple of years ago in Oxford in England where they took, because of the stresses of modern life, they took 2 groups of executives, and at lunchtime they had one of them just have their lunch on the go, keep on during meetings, and the other group, they took them to a museum in London and had them just walk by and see the masterpieces and so forth. And they had IV cannulas inserted, and they were measuring levels of adrenaline constantly every 10 minutes, 15 minutes or so. And they found that those people who actually went to this museum and away from their work for that brief period of time had significant decline in their adrenergic hormones. And their level of stress went down dramatically. And those that just continued, they had a working lunch, as they call it, the meeting, and they had continuously elevated level of stress. If you look at the afternoon prayer, it's exactly at that time, which is modern day's lunchtime. So these 5 times, one is about an hour and a half before sunrise. So anytime from an hour and a half till about 10-15 minutes before sunrise. And that's where your day begins. So you begin your day with remembering God and to reaffirm your covenant with God about how you're going to lead your day. And then in the middle of the day, when you're right at the peak of your stress, you break away for 10 minutes. And all you need is about 10 minutes. 10 minutes to go to your room, your office, some corner, and you pray. And so now there's a medical benefit to it as well. We're not looking for medical, we're looking for spiritual benefits, but there's a medical benefit. And then you have an afternoon prayer, and then the 4th prayer is immediately after sunset, because Muslims consider the new day to begin when the sun sets. In Muslim tradition, the night comes first. And it comes with the sunset. The second day starts with the sunset. So your night, you remember that, and then before you go to bed, the final prayer. And that's because you never know if you're going to wake up the next day. And so your final act before you go to bed is again to renew your covenant with God. And so that's kind of the nutshell of the 5 prayers, if Brother Ayub has anything else to say.
The only thing I would add is that, there's a difference between a formal prayer and then supplication to God directly. So there's the formal prayer, which is the 5 prayers that we talked about, and then what we often think of as prayer in a Christian sense is speaking to God. And so that's what Muslims do, and there's another term for that, which is dua, which is supplication. And Muslims at all times are encouraged to ask God for what they need, tell God that they love Him, etc.
Yeah, we had when I was at King Faisal Specialist Hospital and Research Center in Riyadh, which is one of the largest research centers in the Middle East, and we had to tell half of the staff was Westerners, physicians, nurses from the US and Europe. We had to tell them that if they saw the local Saudis walking by and mumbling, they shouldn't consider them mad or crazy, because Muslims will generally be seen, because Muslims are supposed to supplicate at all times. Their tongues are to be remembering God at all times. This is the informal one that Brother Ayub was talking about. And so we had to tell them, if you see a lot of people just have the prayer beads in their hands, or their lips are just moving, that's because that's part of the tradition.
I know that we have probably many more questions we would like to ask, but we're going to kind of close down and respect your time. 2 last things. If you are interested, if you are a student or part of the medical school, and you're interested in going to the mosque on Friday, the Islamic Doctors Association said you get a hold of them or email me, and we'll arrange some transportation to Prestonsburg. There's a little hall from here, and also get up an Adams Branch and figure out how the mosque is. It can be a little more complex, but you can also follow the Fitzpatrick Baptist sign. That's a very good indicator that you're on the road for the mosque. One last question as we close tonight. Question about conversion. If either of you are a convert to Islam, and if so, what led you to convert? Or if not, what's the one thing that made you so appreciative that you hold this faith so dear?
Yeah, great question. I'm actually not a convert. My parents are converts. Both my parents are from Kansas. They went to England, and that was kind of, they lived, they didn't know a lot about the world until they went to England, and then they saw all of these, England at that time, and it still is a place where, many cultures from all over the world mingle, and the United States is becoming more like that now. But then, the UK was an eye-opening experience for them, and so they became Muslim in the 70s, and then so I was born Ayub Palmer, okay, and Ayub is Job in Arabic, okay. So if you want to call me Job, that's all good. It's Job Palmer, Ayub Palmer, okay, and so my parents became. My father used to tell me that one of the things that he really liked about Islam was the names of God. Okay, in the Quran, God has all of these names, like the hearing, the seeing, the all-knowing, the beautiful, the loving. Okay, so there are these names, and he really liked that, the way that Muslims talked about God. He liked the way Muslims talked about God. And so that was something that was a journey for him, and it's a journey for me, growing up as a Muslim. I'm still learning about what Islam is, right? And I'm doing my degree in Islamic studies, right? So yeah.
I was, as far as I can trace back my family, we were all Muslims. At some point, I suspect it was India, so it might have been somebody else. But as far as I can trace, my family was all Muslims. What is about the faith is, I think once your heart is convinced that you're on the truth, then that's it. Then you just, you hang on to it, because that your existence is by virtue of that truth. And one of the names of God, in Islamic tradition is Al-Haq, which is the reality, the real one, the truth. That is the truth. The existence of God is the truth. So I think it's all a matter of, but you bring an important point, because I think a lot of the Muslims are Muslims just because they're born in a Muslim family. And I wrote a small book about it many years ago. And I encourage Muslims to actually start reading their religion themselves and become not just Muslims by birth, but Muslims by choice. Because you're born in it, and I think just like a lot of Christians, they're Christians because they're born in a Christian family. They may not necessarily know the Christian tradition. So I think that it's important for Muslims to read their religion as well. I think one of the most extraordinary things about the converts is that they actually do read the religion. They understand it, and that they make a informed, like the informed consent in medicine. They have an informed choice because they really looked at all the aspects, and in their heart they believe that they found the truth. That's not necessarily true for a lot of Muslims who are born in the Muslim families. It's just something that just came down from their grandfather to their father to them. So, it's important for the Muslims to study their tradition as well.
For those who are members of the community, we really appreciate you coming up on the Hill and visiting us. For those who are students, we're going to close with something that I know Dr. Hess, our academic dean, would greatly appreciate, is what was said earlier. Study. Pour yourself in. That's dean approved, right? To study, to learn more, study your own tradition, study your own faith, study Islam, and not allow the bumper stickers and the uninformed rhetoric to define your exploration towards truth. Thank you so much.